When we talk about Unangax culture, we also have to talk about what I'm calling crossroads of empire, because very much, partly due to the physical location of the Aleutian Islands, the Unangax people traditionally have very much been at the crossroads of different European empires. They were one of the first groups to encounter the Russians, really the first wave of Russian fur traders hit very hard the Unangax and as well as the Shukpiak people, and had a huge effect, again, both through diseases and as well as through battles. As Doug Veltri, the anthropologist, says, battles between Unangax and Russian atrocities, forced Unangax labor, and introduced diseases all took their toll, and no part of traditional Unangax culture was left unchanged. So there's a reading I used to have people do by Debbie Corbett, who's a fantastic anthropologist, an archaeologist who really has an eye towards listening to current day people as well. And she writes Journey into Sky Worlds, which is a reading I would recommend to you. I used to require it, but there's only so many readings I can require, especially of a summer course. But anyways, in Journey into Sky Worlds, Debbie Corbett talks about sort of what we know about the belief structures of Onondaga people prior to Russian Christianity becoming a main form of people's spirituality. Like, what did people believe prior to that? And the answer is we do know some things, definitely, and it's really beautiful and interesting to know some of those stories, but also that, as Doug Veltri is getting into here, a lot's been lost, right? A lot of knowledge has been lost because the effect was so dramatic and sudden of Russian battles, Russian violent conflict, and diseases and things, and people sometimes being taken captive as a way of forcing other people to trade and do labor. And unfortunately, the population, as a result, you had basically like kind of 8 different distinct like language, dialect, community kind of areas of the Aleutian Islands for Onondaga people. 3 of those like basically disappeared. And I don't know all the details of that, but kind of like over time, those villages became more abandoned. And so eventually you had like a coalescing into a smaller number of villages and the population did decline. The population has gotten to a point now where there are quite a few larger population in the Aleutian Islands than there was maybe 200 years ago, but that's taken time, and that reflects the population effects that happened and the huge effect that has on culture when that many people pass away, which will definitely be a recurring theme. Sorry, these are, I know, really difficult things to talk about, and might hit differently for some of us than others, so I kind of want to acknowledge that. Another thing that happened that was really difficult for Onondaga culture and affected kind of what communities look like today is World War II. So many of you know this already. It's one of the better covered, I guess, aspects of Alaska Native history in Alaska, in my experience. But basically during World War II, Japanese forces invaded the island of Attu and 2 other Aleutian islands as part of an offensive against the United States. For 14 months, Attu was occupied by Japanese forces. It was eventually retaken by US military forces. During the meantime, though, during the interim, what happened is that about 800 Onondaga people were relocated from islands that were perceived to be kind of in the direction of the Japanese occupation, that it was like, oh, well, they're coming this direction. And so several of the villages were evacuated and taken elsewhere, and including in Southeast Alaska. And a lot of people lost their lives, unfortunately, because where they were housed was very cold. They weren't like properly housed. And so people lost their lives from becoming very cold while they were in this like temporary location. And then even after the war, unfortunately, and this is not meant to be a put down, it's perhaps more just a commentary on what sometimes happens that can, or of what did happen, that is an important thing to talk about. It's not meant to be a put down of like all the armed forces, but at least a few of the soldiers ended up like ransacking the homes. And so there was a lot of like people's like stuff, people's material wealth that was like taken from their homes, both by the invading army's destruction, but then also by the retaking armies, like some of the soldiers that did that stuff. And I presume those were rogue actions. I'm not sure, but either way it happened. And that's a really hard part of the history. And also Attu was, people wanted to resettle in Attu, but they didn't allow that. They eventually turned that into like a Lonar, I think is how you pronounce it, but basically like a radar station of sorts, a tracking station for the military. And so A2 is no longer a village. And so really strong effects, right, from colonialism even into the 20th century. In this case, sort of Japanese colonialism, right, the attempt to take over large parts of the Pacific Islands that had a very direct effect on sort of a very small group of people, right? The Unangax compared to the Japanese military were a very small force, and they kind of got caught up in the power struggle of Japan trying to invade US territories. That's all some really hard things to talk about. I do want to emphasize, though, I like to also emphasize sort of survivance, people's ongoing survival, but not just survival, but also revitalization and people pushing forward and bringing things back and success stories and triumph stories. With that in mind, if it plays properly, I'd like to watch a video. Let's see if it works or not. With any sort of luck, this will play, and if it doesn't, I apologize, and the link is in the sides, but we will give it a try.
Hello, my name is Ethan, and I am Unangax from Alaska. Our effort in Alaska is...
So just as a quick aside, as far as people like revitalizing traditional ways of dress, particularly when they're doing a dance, there's a lot to like notice here that's really awesome and cool. Portrayals of traditional culture from several hundred years previous, among them people wearing coverings that have like dentalium shells. So those long white shells you'll see those in a lot of traditional regalia or clothing, ceremonial clothing for Alaska Native groups. And so dentalium shells for some groups had to be obtained from far away in trading relationships. And they were oftentimes symbols of sort of hard work, effort, industry, wealth, things like that. You also notice that the narrator, he's got a visor on, and so those were actually like a traditional like wooden visor that were found in many parts of the Aleutian Islands. They had different designs depending on where you were, but that was a very common thing that people wore that would have really helped them with like seeing when they were kayaking, among other things.
To revitalize our spirit. And we're doing that in my region through language and through our traditional dance. Some years ago, I wanted to revitalize it because I thought, I want this out, and we're the only group not dancing in Alaska. We've put our dancing aside, and ours was because of World War II. In World War II, the Japanese dropped bombs in Dutch Harbor, which was a military post on Alaska Island. The Americans rounded us up, and people were evacuated out. We couldn't bring anything with us, including any religious items, any spiritual things, any traditional clothing, anything. And so when we returned to our villages, the American military had ransacked the houses and everything had been taken for souvenirs. The ship would go through each village and pick up all the people. When they got to Alaska, there were mixed marriages. And those families, the native spouse and the children had to go, and the whites got to stay. And at that point, our leaders and chiefs were saying, there's something wrong with this. From there, we were interned for 3.5, 4 years in camps in southeast Alaska, and they were abandoned mines or abandoned fish cannery camps. And so they're just like a warehouse with, big cracks in the floor and no insulation, nothing. In those camps, life was horrible. There was a third of our population died. And for a third of us to die in the camps because of, you look at the death certificates of the children in those camps, all it says, reason of death, pain. So you tell me what that means. It's really impacted our people, Unangax people, the World War II experience. Some villages stopped speaking their language. Some people, we can't be Unangax anymore There's no history, there's no future. We got to be white, we got to pretend we're somebody else. And so we've been struggling as Native people since then to revitalize our culture. So I worked with the school district in Aleutian region, and we put together a plan and a program to revitalize dance and song. We still had elders who remembered and then remembered songs and did dancing when they were young. We pulled out Russian journals that wrote a lot about our music. We had wax cylinders recorded. There were wax cylinders recorded. We had them transferred onto cassette tapes. So we studied our music that from long ago. We did it was our entire half a day in our schools was spent on culture only. Language, dancing, traditional arts and crafts, and creation of new music. We'd been practicing for a year and a half, I guess, and we said, okay, we've got a performance put together, now let's bring the elders. We were nervous, we were afraid. None of us had we'd never danced for a village before. And so we put a performance on. We did all of our dances. And all the talking was done in our language. And at the end, the chief, the leader of the community, stood up. And we looked, and there were elders with tears in their eyes. And he started talking to us, and he started to cry even, and held his heart, and he said, he goes, this is stuff we remember from when we were children, before World War II. He goes, it brings so many good memories, and you see tears in our eyes. He goes, these are tears of happiness and joy. We're so happy to see this come back to life. He goes, the children are beautiful. He goes, and this is our dance. Since then, it's spread to every island. Every village in our region now is dancing and has danced.
I think it's a spiritual war for us because we've gone through so much. To me, I see it as a way for us to keep up the resistance.
So I really like that video. I hope you did too. I like that theme of renewal, right? So I subtitled that Tradition, Empire, and Renewal, this discussion of Unangax culture. Obviously, there were so many huge effects of colonialism and then more from World War II. And then I like that this story emphasizes too, though, people having resilience and bringing back traditional forms of dance and just how much that meant for elders. I thought that was a really powerful story and a hopeful story. And I hope that you enjoyed it as well. And that's where we'll pause this specific video.